Hi, everyone. It's 2 o'clock, so we're just about ready to get started with our local government strategies for 100% clean energy webinar. We're happy to have everybody here, and we're happy that everyone took time out of your schedule to be able to attend this. We're looking forward to hopefully providing everyone with some useful information and a couple of steps to get toward increasing your clean energy procurement, ideally up to 100%. With that, we'll get started. So just a short agenda and schedule of what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Danny Falk with the Solar Foundation, and I'll be doing a short introduction to the SolSmart program, which is putting on this webinar. So just a little bit about the program and our purpose in the purpose in the program, as well as the webinar itself. Additionally, we'll have Deb Perry with the Cadmus Group introducing 100% to clean energy and what it is and how it can be defined, things like that. And then we'll go into a couple of experiences with a couple of communities, including the city of Boise with Steve Hubble. And we'll also be hearing from Buncombe County in North Carolina and Jeremiah LeRoy. And then we'll also be hearing about Westchester in Pennsylvania from Aurora Eddington at Cadmus. And then we'll have a short Q&A at the end to go over any questions that anyone might have for any of our presenters. This is also the first of our 3 webinar series on procuring renewable energy, which we'll go into a little bit more information on that. But we have 2 upcoming webinars, one in July and one in August, which I will be giving a little bit more information on at the end of the webinar. So we hope you guys will enjoy this and join us for that as well. So just a little bit of information about SolSmart. We're a DOE-funded program through the Solar Energy Technologies Office. SolSmart's goal is to essentially help local governments knock down some of what we call the soft costs of solar for residents and businesses. So things like permitting and inspection, issues like that. Our program is open to any U.S. municipalities, counties, and regional organizations that are interested. How we work is we have designation criteria, and if those designation criteria are met, we recognize these solar achievements by designating communities either gold, silver, bronze. And in order to get to that designation, we also provide no-cost technical assistance to communities. These are a couple of the organizations that we work with, both on the technical assistance program side and the designation program administrator side. Just for a little bit of background information. And as mentioned before, we work across a lot of different categories in the soft cost area and provide technical assistance in them. Here's just a short list of them for a little bit of background. And we also wanted to just acknowledge that our work is based on a deal.
This is Deb. I can jump in. I think Danny may have lost his sound. But so I think Danny was going to say we are funded by DOE, and just want to acknowledge that that this work is funded by them, but is not their not representing their opinions. Danny, if you're there, can you do next slide? Excellent. So we can just skip ahead to the next slide. I'm Deb Perry with the Cadmus Group, part of the SolSmart team. Cadmus provides technical assistance to the SolSmart program and therefore works with a lot of communities who are working toward clean energy goals. If you could go to the next slide. Excellent. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview to how we are working and how seeing communities pursue pathways to 100% clean energy. Anyone who's dabbled in this process probably knows it can be quite confusing, a little overwhelming, often taking you in many different directions and feeling like there's lots and lots of decisions to be made. I'm going to try to simplify this a little bit and present some of the kind of key steps as we see and understand them. And then I will, like Danny said, be turning it over to hear about 3 different communities and how they pursued this process. If you can go to the next slide. Excellent. So there are over 150 cities, at least 10 counties, and at least 7 states across the U.S. who have already adopted ambitious clean energy goals to getting to 100%, including 6 cities who have already hit that target. So this is possible. I think that's something important to keep in mind if you're just getting started. If you could go to the next slide. I am going to move through this fairly quickly. There's a lot to cover. Often the first step really is thinking about your goal. And this really depends on your local context, your priorities. It can be driven by the decision about what a meaningful time frame is for your community. We often see communities setting their goals with different years, different targets. Here's some examples that we commonly see. And if you've endeavored into this process, you've probably thought about some of these and what the trade-offs are in terms of how to frame your goal. So we often see communities think about 100% renewable electricity goal by a certain year, and others are more focused more broadly on 100% renewable energy goal. So that goes beyond electricity. In some cases, we see communities state an amount of renewable energy they want to deploy. For example, 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy by a certain date. Or maybe more broadly talking about clean energy. Again, depends what the priorities are with your community and what will resonate there. And then the last example here, a goal that's really about carbon emissions. For example, the 80% carbon reduction by 2050 is a common goal that we see, and that's in line with the Paris Agreement. So again, really there are trade-offs and reasons to pick any one of these goals. They all have certain pros and certain cons. If you do go with a percentage goal, I think one thing to realize is that means you are going to need to project out into the future what your total electricity or energy use will be. So that's going to require you to think about, is your community growing? Is your building stock changing? Are you electrifying? Are you adding electric vehicles, for example? Is your energy use growing overall? What are your efficiency programs and what are their projections? So if you're going to project a goal out into the future and have it be percentage basis, you will need to do the work to understand your baseline and how that is looking out into the future to make sure that the set of strategies that you select stack up and meet that goal. Something like a deployment goal, 1,000 megawatts deployed by a certain date, maybe feels easier, but also you need to recognize that the drawback there is if your community isn't working on efficiency or if your energy use is growing over time, this may not actually reduce your dependence on fossil fuels. So if that's your goal, if your total energy use continues to grow and you deploy your 1,000 megawatts, will that actually mean that that you are less dependent on fossil fuels over time? It may or it may not. So if you want to go to the next, another factor in terms of how you frame your goals really are what are your priorities and how do you kind of balance these? So you might really be focused on increasing renewable energy capacity. You might have other priorities around environmental impacts, other local impacts like aesthetics, equity impacts, financial impacts like job creation. So all of these can weigh into the decision around how to frame your goal and what kind of strategies you select. If you could go to the next slide. So again, trying to break down what can be a fairly complicated process of transforming your energy supply, we think of this in kind of 3 big steps, and I'll walk through these. If you go to the next slide. The first step really is to understand your energy landscape. And when we say this, we really mean understanding the type of utility environment that you're working in, and then also the regulatory environment and what kind of state policies are at play. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with utility first. and again, I'm simplifying some things here to fit into a 10-minute presentation, but understanding the kind of utility environment and the kind of utility that you're working with is really important to understanding what potential strategies are available to you. So this map is showing regulated and deregulated markets. So in the darkest blue, at least it's blue on my slide, but the darkest color, these are places where you have retail electricity choice, so folks can actually choose their electric supplier. In the lightest color, there's partial retail electricity choice, and in the middle blue, no retail electricity choice. So understanding that is definitely fundamental to understanding what kinds of strategies are possible. And then understanding the specific structure of your utility. The three big types are here on the left, the investor-owned utilities, rural electric co-ops, and municipal utilities. Each one of them has a different structure, and each one of them will have enable you to do different things. In the case where you're working at a regional level, you may even have different utilities operating within that region, and so understanding each one of them will be important so that you can flag which kinds of strategies might work in different parts of your region. If you want to go to the next slide. Like I said, the other part of understanding your landscape is the state policy environment. And there are lots of different state policies that you'll want to be aware of and understand. These are just two examples. Understanding what the net metering policies are in your state and whether that's going to be favorable to deploying solar, for example, and how that will affect local economics for renewable energy. The map on the right is states that allow power purchase agreements. So again, understanding whether that could be an option in your community will help you to narrow in on strategy. But again, there's a variety of things you'll want to understand about state policy, and I can point you to some resources that help list those out. If you go to the next slide. So once you have a grasp of the landscape that you're operating in, really the next step is thinking about what are those available strategies. We lump these into three categories: consumer-oriented strategies, kind of municipal operation strategies, and then utility-focused strategies. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to move pretty quickly through some tables, and these slides will absolutely be provided after the presentation, and I encourage you to look at each one. There's a lot of information on these, but I'm going to be showing you some tables, and I wanted to start with the legend. So on these tables that you'll see for strategies, green means it's an available strategy, blue means it's potentially available but dependent on state legislation or utility structure. The darker blue, there might be an opportunity for you to influence that strategy, and then in the yellow, the strategy is likely not applicable. So if you can remember that legend, I didn't want to shrink it down so small that it was unreadable. So hopefully everybody can take a mental picture of this, and we'll go to the next slide. And like I said, I suspect folks will want to kind of digest this a bit. So I think getting the slides after will be an opportunity to do that. But in terms of consumer-oriented strategies, what you're seeing is things like creating local incentives, working on permitting and zoning and reducing the time and costs for that. Working on things like community solar. So these are strategies that are really focused at the consumer. And then in the table, you're seeing whether those are applicable if you have an IOU, an investor-owned utility, a co-op, or a municipal utility. Again, with green being that is applicable. Blue is kind of dependent, and if you have the map, dependent on legislation. If you have the little infrastructure, then that's dependent on the utility, and then yellow is likely not applicable. So these are the consumer-oriented strategies. If you go to the next slide, we'll take a quick look at the municipally targeted strategies. So often cities choose to pursue strategies on their own buildings and their own properties as a way to lead by example, and also because it's really under your control. And so again, looking at where those are applicable in IOUs, co-ops, and municipal utilities. And then if you go to the next slide, utility-focused strategies. So this is things like engaging with the utility, potentially establishing a city and utility partnership, things like a local renewable portfolio standard, working with the utility to conduct a feasibility study for energy procurement. All of these are strategies that are essentially involving partnering with and working with the utility to move things forward. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. The last step in our kind of three-step process here is about organizing capacity, resources, and partnerships. So certainly bringing these strategies to life and to implementation requires a lot of work. And so staffing up, making sure that you have the staff that you need to bring those strategies to fruition, which can also involve partnerships and collaboration. Often to really make these things happen is going to involve engaging with many people in your community and creating some unique partnerships to help move projects forward. Engaging with stakeholders and engaging with the community, again, really key here to advancing the ideas and bringing them to fruition. So if you go to the next slide. This is trying to break down really the process of bringing together the renewable energy strategy. And there's, again, a lot of information here, but moving from left to right, to create a renewable energy strategy begins with sourcing the ideas, the input, and understanding your baseline, reviewing your existing plans, your existing programs, gathering up the data, and working with the community to have a vision. So moving over across into the selection, where we start to go into red. So if you source your ideas, you have your vision, you have your goal, you likely have a whole long set of potential strategies, probably too many to really get your arms around. So thinking about how to filter those and what some of those criteria might be. Here we list things like impact and your potential influence over the strategy, mission alignment, political feasibility, financial feasibility, and technical feasibility, which essentially can act as a filter to bring you down to a set of draft goals and strategies that hopefully is a number that's a little bit more manageable, and ultimately bringing that all together into a final plan. And again, you'll hear from some folks who've been through this process and can talk more about what that actually looked like for them. If you want to go to the next slide. I did want to touch on the idea of scenario modeling. So one thing we often see is communities wanting to make sure that the set of strategies that they select build up to getting them to their final goal or target. And we use scenario modeling often to do that. So these steps, I talked before a little bit about developing your baseline, understanding the consumption in your community over time. And then as you identify your policies and actions, you're identifying the expected impacts of those actions. And through a model, you can add those impacts together and basically be looking at whether that set of strategies can get you to your goal, and also understand the other environmental or economic outputs, how many jobs could be created, other environmental benefits, carbon emissions, things like that can be done through a scenario modeling approach. If you want to go to the next slide. I wanted to circle back to that idea of different priorities and how that might translate in your final plan, and just give you some examples of how, depending on what your priorities are, how that can look quite different. So examples here, if your priority really is about local renewable energy installed, then ultimately you may end up focusing on strategies that are maybe smaller scale. And that might mean that they have different economics than if you were to invest in a very large scale project that was maybe outside of your community. Just an example. If your focus is on climate resilience, then you likely will find yourself focusing on strategies that help build the resilience of the electrical grid, or maybe of particular facilities within your community. And again, that might impact the scale of the projects that you're looking at, and you might have a different set of economics in terms of resilience values that you're looking at, not just energy economics. If your focus is on equity, then you may find yourself focused more on things like local programs, job creations, and working more on focusing on low-income communities and income-related market barriers. And lastly, if your focus is very much on financial savings to the city, you may find yourself looking more at renewable energy purchasing programs and looking at things like buying renewable energy certificates, more so than maybe installing local projects. So just some examples of how, depending on your priorities, your strategies may end up looking quite different. You got to go to the next slide. I promised to point you to some additional resources. This Pathways to 100 energy primer, this is where a lot of those graphics on strategies came from. And so there's even a longer list in that document. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We did try to organize what are the most common and widely used strategies and where they're applicable in that document. I think it's quite useful. And then I also wanted to point out the SolSmart toolkit here, obviously, is a really great resource to help you get oriented around your solar strategy in particular, and where you can, what kinds of things you can work on in terms of making your community more solar friendly and a stronger solar market. And then if you could go to the last slide. Oh, one more. There we go. Before I turn it over to our community speakers, I did want to touch on the reality of COVID-19 and implications for renewable energy planning. You know, first and foremost, I think we are obviously seeing a lot of impacts on local budgets and local staffing and the ability to take on this work right at this time. That said, with headlines about record-breaking heat in the Arctic, I very much hope that this work does not slow down and that we can find ways to really forge ahead and not pause our work on ambitious renewable energy goals. I think there are three things in particular I wanted to point out as kind of unique challenges of COVID-19 if you're embarking on renewable energy planning. One is this challenge around finding meaningful approaches to virtual engagement. You know, again, one of our first steps is always stakeholder engagement and engaging the community to create the vision and to talk about those priorities. And doing so on a virtual platform is something that many of us are working on right now, and how to make that work and how to make it meaningful, particularly as it relates to underrepresented communities. Often the strategies that have worked in the past for reaching those communities involve a lot of in-person work, whether that's workshops or attending meetings and getting out into the community. And with a lot of that stuff not possible right now, I think that's a unique challenge that that we need to get really innovative around. 2020 data, I think, is going to be challenging for a while, and it'll be interesting over time to see if it's an anomaly or going to be part of a new normal. But I would say I would not use 2020 data to create a baseline. Obviously, we're seeing some very unique patterns around energy consumption with people working from home and with buildings vacant. And so I think 2020 will always stand out as a bit of an anomaly, but maybe also a kickoff into a new normal with some different energy patterns, but time will tell. And I also think, lastly here, 2020 may prove to be a trial run for some future strategies. Things like telecommuting. We'll see if over time some of those patterns hold. And for those of you who are maybe considering whether strategies around telecommuting were going to have the impacts you were hoping for, 2020 might be a time that you're going to find out. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Steve Hubble from Boise. And again, we've picked 3 communities that have been through this process and are going to talk to us a little bit more about what they did and what they learned. So Steve, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Deb. It's really exciting to be with the group today and share a little bit about Boise's process and what we've been up to. Certainly, as Deb mentioned, it's a lot of content to fit into 10 minutes. So try to touch everything at a high level, but if you have follow-up questions, save them for the end during that time. And our plan and information is on our website, so encourage you to take a look at that. Has a lot more detail than I'm able to focus on today. Next slide. So just some background on Boise. We are the capital of Idaho. Population in the city is around 230,000. With about 700,000 in our region known as the Treasure Valley. We're the most geographically isolated, largest geographically isolated city in the lower 48. Our utilities are regulated and vertically integrated. Idaho Power for electricity and Intermountain Gas for our natural gas. For many years, Boise's been focused a lot with sustainability and energy, mainly focused towards our municipal or internal operations with things like electric vehicles and municipal building energy use goals. And sort of the exciting part about Boise's energy future, which I'm going to talk about, it really gave us an opportunity to kind of pivot out and take a look at some of these issues on a community-wide basis, giving us an opportunity to provide leadership there. Next slide. So a little bit about the project. As you can imagine, Boise is a practical city. We were really focused on planning first and then setting achievable goals. So back in 2018, we started a renewable energy planning process, which we named Boise's Energy Future. And first step there was putting together our project team. We enlisted some consulting assistance from a firm that had experience helping other communities with this work. And then establishing a group of both internal and external technical stakeholders. And then obviously from there, kind of the typical process that you look at through these efforts with data collection, with community engagement, with the development of goals and opportunities, and now transitioning into the implementation phase. And I'll give some examples of those as we go through the slides. Next slide. Starting with data, it was important to us to kind of understand how energy was being used in our community. A lot of planning process had maybe focused more on electricity than some of the other energy sources. So we really wanted to understand what our circumstances were. The graphic here shows our community-wide energy use on a standardized basis. So those percentages are in BTUs. And I think interestingly, the split in terms of energy usage between electricity and natural gas is very even. So certainly something to keep in mind, that if we're really interested at getting towards 100% renewable energy, we can't focus on one or the other. We really need to focus on both. And then just to clarify for this process, we weren't really looking at transportation fuels. We were really focused on building energy. And the reason we did that is because it was the largest component of our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we felt it was important to focus there, sort of taking a bottom-up approach as opposed to other communities who might work top-down through a climate action planning process. Next slide. I should mention, as you moved off of that slide, we do have a geothermal heating district in Boise. So that little 2% geothermal that you saw at the bottom, that is accurate and is a really cool asset that we have here. And certainly if we had more time, could share more there. We're fortunate in Idaho when we think about our electricity generation mix, a lot of hydroelectric already in the system. So we really have a good baseline or head start when compared to some other communities, electricity mixes, particularly in other parts of the country. And also some prior commitments from our investor-owned utility to move out of the coal generation space. And you can see those trends over a 4-year period moving downward, and we expect that to continue. So in a really good starting point there compared to some others. Next slide, please. Wanted to share a little about our community engagement. Obviously, we had a multi-pronged strategy for that, and community engagement is really important through these processes, but probably not always going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and needs to be tailored to the particular needs of a particular community. But this shares some data of a statistically significant survey process that we went through with residents in our community, both generally showing a pretty good level of support for the idea of transitioning to clean energy, and also a high level of agreement with concerns on the impact of climate change to our local environment. Next slide. We also polled on our community's priorities. And I think it was interesting that the top two, so clean energy and affordability, could in some ways be conflicting. So that was something that we had to keep in mind as we set our actions and strategies as we move towards our clean energy transition goals. Next slide. So where we ended up, we took a sort of two-path approach to goal setting. One focused on electricity, which you see here, and another focused on our thermal energy sources, so our natural gas and our geothermal, which I'll talk about in just a second. But essentially where we ended up was establishing a 100% clean electricity goal for our community by 2035, and then embedded within that was the same goal at 2030 for our municipal operations. And then if you look at the bottom half of the slide in the opportunities, what we did was we did a very intensive calculation process to determine how each of those opportunities contributed to that 100% goal. So for example, what contributions are gained from electricity efficiency, on-site solar, with our existing utility scale generation, what portions of that are already clean and renewable, and then looking forward, what portions of that need to become renewable as new generation comes online in the future. And then finally closing out the gap with some power procurement opportunities. Next slide. As the city started down the road of its process, we were working frequently with our investor-owned utility, Idaho Power, and I would say that relationship continued to improve throughout the planning process, and we were really excited when about 2 weeks before the city completed our process and established our own goals that Idaho Power announced their own clean energy transition goal. They set a target of 2045, so slightly different timelines, but I think still encouraging and still a lot of opportunity for potential to work together with the city and their team. Next slide. Touching quickly on our thermal goals. We took a different approach there. We didn't set a quantitative goal like some of the examples that Deb mentioned in her slides. We really focused on actions at this point, and that's primarily because of the somewhat challenging nature in transitioning away from natural gas. But we're interested in pursuing some opportunities with efficiency, with renewable natural gas, obviously looking at options to expand our geothermal systems here in town, and then where practical, looking at renewable energy sourcing, or perhaps a politically correct phase for beneficial electrification at the time when this was developed. Next slide. So we are in, I guess, moving into just about year 2 of implementation. It's a 15-year plan, so we realize that many of these actions will take some time to carry out, but we've been focused primarily at the beginning here on increasing customer participation in existing electricity and natural gas efficiency programs. We've also been very active with participation in various regulatory activities, whether it be with the Idaho Public Utilities Commission and commenting on cases that could have beneficial impact on our transition and on plans that we've developed. We also participate pretty frequently with our advisory groups that our electric utility has, both their integrated resources plan, so their 20-year plan, and also their energy efficiency group. We'll be working some more on our thermal plan to get more quantitative goals there, and also moving into some more detailed planning around climate action. Next slide. And then quickly, lessons learned. I think I'm coming up against my time, but community engagement. I think we did a good job with the resources that we had, but certainly I think there's always an opportunity to do better there. I think one example is we did a pretty good job engaging big business, but perhaps not as good on small business. Also, certainly the more you hear about current plans, the more importance it's provided to foundational equity. And I would say that's probably an area that was a little weaker in some of our planning process, and an opportunity that we'll hope to improve on as we go forward into implementation. We did do some financial analysis, but quantifying some of those risks, benefits, and externalities was somewhat limited. Maybe thinking about things around public health or around economic impacts were sort of challenging to quantify. So we think there's some opportunities to do more there. And then in terms of data specificity, so right now our utilities only provide us community-wide data. We're not really able to hone in on more specifics in terms of smaller geographies in the city. So that's a challenge. Thanks for the time. Look forward to answering questions, and I'll pass it on to Jeremiah.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate it. That was actually really informative for me too. So I appreciate your time today. I don't think anybody needs to spend too much time staring at my ugly mug, so you can move on to the next slide. So a little local context with Buncombe County here in Western North Carolina. We're a relatively small county, and the city of Asheville is sort of our county seat. And so some of you may have heard of the city of Asheville, a pretty popular tourist destination in this part of the country, but we have a 100% renewable internal operational goal by 2030. We also have a 100% renewable community-wide goal by 2042. And the city of Asheville has a very similar internal operational goal by 2030. And they, in their resolution, pledged to support the county and its community goal to reach by 2042. So the regulatory framework here in North Carolina, just because it's really important to understand when you start talking about strategies, and Debra did a really good job of sort of explaining why it's important to have this framework in mind when you're thinking about your strategies, is that here in North Carolina, we have a regulated monopoly. And so Duke Energy is the largest investor-owned utility in the US, and they are our regulated monopoly. So we have to work within that framework, and it definitely presents its challenges, in terms of accomplishing the goal when you have zero power over the utility mix and the power mix. So, and of course, the last bullet point there being really critical, that third-party power purchases are not allowed in North Carolina. So if we want power, Duke is where we get it. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So Buncombe County and the city of Asheville, obviously having similar goals and having limited resources, decided to really form a partnership in developing this pathway to 100. Funding and staffing are obviously challenges for smaller local governments. And so collaborating and sharing resources was really the only way to move forward, and really just made sense for us. You're talking to the Sustainability Office for Buncombe County, a very robust office of one. And the city is very lucky to have double the staff that I have. So, when you've got these ambitious renewable energy goals and a total of 3 people working on them, it's obviously presents some challenges. So we issued a joint RFP for renewable energy planning services, and we ended up contracting with the Cadmus Group, which is of course how I ended up here today, to sort of develop our Pathway to 100, or what we refer to as our roadmap to renewables. Next slide. So again, Debra did a really good job of sort of explaining this, but we used this strategy, I think, that Cadmus really pointed out, in terms of, we called them buckets at first, and then sort of developed into pathways A, B, C, D, in terms of identifying planned local actions that we're already undertaking, the feasible and prioritized local actions that we can take, state and utility level actions, and then alternative purchasing options. And I think the one thing that will stand out to you, and I would think so because it stood out to our community when we showed them this, is when we model the impact that each of these potential pathways has on trying to reach 100%, it's a pretty glaring gap between what we can accomplish and those renewable purchasing options. So we don't have time, obviously, to go into the full report. So as you guys get these slides later on, if you like, I did go ahead and put a link in the slide to the full report. So please feel free to review that and reach out for questions. But I think what's really important here is to point out how much procurement's necessary. For many of us, I think we kind of fall into this same category of really having to look at procurement as a major option. And for us, procurement it is a major barrier because of the fact that we're such a highly regulated utility market. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today was just some of the strategies we did decide to go with in terms of the highly local feasible actions. Obviously, things like streamlining permitting and implementation of high performance green building. These are things that a lot of people either are doing or have already done. The reason I highlight these last two, leasing government-owned land to the utility and aggregated procurement for on-site renewables, is because those are the two actions that we have undertaken in the last year to 18 months since our plan was developed that frankly are going to have the most impact, both in our goal, in reaching our goals, but also just in showing the community that pushed us to adopt these goals that we're really doing the most we can given the environment that we're in. I got a kick out of hearing Steve say we wanted to do the planning and then set a goal, because our community does the exact opposite. They say set the ambitious goal and just figure it out after that. So that's really what we did. The leasing of government-owned land, we actually have a great project that we've developed with our utility where the county is leasing an old landfill, and the utility is building a 5 megawatt solar facility on that landfill here in town, which obviously is great. It's government-owned land. We're giving it to them for a very good deal. We're retaining the renewable energy attributes, so we get the RECs, and we get 5 megawatts of clean energy on our grid in town where folks can see it. And because it's a landfill, obviously there's not a whole lot of development opportunities, so it was a great option for us. The next project that we've had a lot of, well, we'll see about success, we're working on it as we speak, is aggregated procurement for renewable energy on public facilities. So if you'll switch to the next slide. So it really came down to, what do you control? As a local government here in North Carolina, with all the limitations that we had, we really just thought to ourselves, what do we control? Well, here in North Carolina, counties are the funding agencies for the school systems. And so while we don't fund teacher salaries, we basically fund everything else. And so we we hold their debt, we control the school's debt, we do all their construction, and that's city schools here, county schools here, and frankly, our community college as well. And so we really included all of these folks in a large partnership to identify potential sites for on-site solar, do structural assessments, do some initial site design, develop budgets, everything you see there. To, the end goal being to issue a solicitation for as much on-site renewables for public facilities as we could get. And what we ended up with was approximately 50 projects at about 7 megawatts total. So over that last year or so, it's about how long it's taken us to do this, we finally issued that solicitation. And in fact, the timing's great because the bids for the solicitations were due last Friday. And so I've been obviously spending my time reviewing all the bids for those projects, and it's actually very, very exciting because the purpose of doing this aggregated renewable project was hopefully to gain economies of scale, right? Doing these projects as a one-off would be very expensive, and doing them aggregated, we're hoping that some bulk purchasing would apply here, and that economies of scale would gain us enough leverage to get lower pricing so that we could make a really solid argument that these projects altogether can get funded by the county and actually end up being a cash flow positive project for us in terms of our debt service versus our utility savings. So the good news is 3 of the top bids that came in last Friday met that criteria. So the 3 lowest bids for us actually do provide us with cash flow positive savings versus what debt financing would be if we do all these projects at once. So I've still got to talk my board into it, but it's very, very exciting. Next slide, please. Some additional efforts, obviously, you know, in North Carolina, when we don't have control over our utility environment, we have to work with the utility. And so we're very fortunate that Duke, after much poking and prodding, has worked with us to develop the Climate Collaborative, is what we call it, which is basically just a group of local governments working together with the utility company to help us reach our goal. They have developed a green tariff program. It's not great. It's a work in progress, and we've kicked some ideas back to them to enhance it and make it better. But the fact that they did it was a big first step for them. There's a link to check that out. It's called the Green Source Advantage Program. It really didn't work for us, but the fact that they're trying is meaningful to us. We've also got the Cities Initiative, which is funded through the Environmental Defense Fund here in North Carolina, which is another partnership between local governments to address climate crisis by sharing resources, leveraging our collective voices, and really focusing on policy level decisions. So I guess you could sort of call that our lobbying arm. And that's, you know, we'll see how that stuff ends up working out, but we're really working hard to try and change policy at the state level to make things like third-party power purchase agreements a possibility for us here in North Carolina. So that's a super quick version of some of the things that we're doing here in Buncombe County. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Aurora Eddington from the Cadmus Group.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today and to be presenting on a really important topic. So I'm a senior analyst with the Cadmus Group, where I work on primarily renewable energy planning and decarbonization plans. So if you could go to the next slide. As an overview, while there's some overlap with what we've heard already, I'm actually going to be focusing on speaking to data-driven analysis that our team worked on in the last year to help a group of 6 townships in the Westchester area in Pennsylvania study strategies for achieving the renewable energy goals. So as you can see here on the slide, several townships in the Westchester Area Council of Government were interested in studying strategies for achieving their goals as listed here: 100% renewable electricity by 2035 and 100% renewable energy. So that means including transportation and building, heating and cooling by 2050. So if you go to the next slide, here I'm showing a diagram that's depicting the general approach we took to helping the Westchester area townships think through the renewable energy goals. At a high level, you know, this includes stakeholder and community engagement, strategy analysis and siting review, and energy and financial impact modeling at a high level, and helping to identify actionable and contextually appropriate strategies. So if you go to the next slide, very quick, but right now, however, I'm just focusing on this last bucket here, and specifically focusing on the energy impact modeling. Over the next several slides, I'll speak more about the analyzed baseline energy and electricity levels, as Deb had spoken to, give an example of how we analyze the potential energy impacts of one specific strategy, and then we'll conclude with a high-level results figure, and then just a general discussion of some benefits and limitations to modeling. So if you move to the next slide, you know, I want to state that for communities, and as Deb had mentioned, aiming to reach a percentage goal, it's important to understand the baseline consumption at the outset to show the scale of change necessary to achieve the higher shares of renewable energy that are wanted. Given that the Westchester area townships had both an electricity and an energy level goal, we used source data from the transportation and building sectors to determine which fuel sources were supplying energy in the townships, as you can see from this modeling workflow diagram below. So the source of data you're using is really important. In this case, in addition to direct data we received from the townships, we also drew from other sources of data, including the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, and other national level data sources like the US Census and the Energy Information Administration. If you go to the next slide, here we're actually looking at, most current at the time of the project energy consumption information. So using the data as described on the last slide, we pulled together the following charts. The pie chart on the left is showing energy consumption by sector. A large takeaway here is that the transportation sector consumes the greatest share of energy in the Westchester area overall, followed by commercial and industrial sector. The bar chart on the right further breaks this down to illustrate various fuel types used from the different sectors. So if you go to the next slide, we show a couple other pie charts that are just another way of looking at the total energy use. So the pie chart on the left is showing energy consumption by energy source overall, and you'll note that electricity is one of those wedges. And then the pie chart on the right is breaking down that electricity wedge further. So, one of the big takeaways here is that a lot of, there's not that many renewables in the Westchester area's resource mix in 2018. So there's, a lot to be done in this area. So if you go to the next slide, I'll speak now to the baseline analysis and projecting electricity use. So we're moving from the current breakdown of energy sources in those pie charts we just reviewed to the baseline projections of the electricity mix. Given that the Westchester area townships were interested in near-term strategies and transformations, we focused our modeling and our baseline on the electricity sector, as it offers more potential for renewables transformation and meeting clean energy goals in the near term. And also, it's the foundation for, electrifying the transportation and heating sectors and buildings. So the figure here is showing a forecast of what the Westchester area energy mix could look like through 2050, assuming no further action is taken by the townships and no significant policy changes. To orient you here, the y-axis is showing the electricity generation, while the different colors represent different energy sources. The baseline is powerful in that it's helping us understand what kind and magnitude of action may need to be taken. It serves to compare a point of no comparison, to provide a point of comparison from no action being taken to comparing how certain strategies affect the amount of renewable energy in the system. You'll note the box on the side is highlighting some key assumptions of the baseline projection around nuclear, coal, and renewables resources, which are really key to make and then be transparent about as you're conducting exercises of this nature. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to start turning to one example of how we quantitatively assessed the likely energy impacts of a strategy that the townships wanted to further study. At a high level, note that to model any strategy, it's important to decide on a couple points of consideration as shown in the figure on this slide. These include, the year the strategy may take effect, or, the timeline to expect it to be implemented, the area the strategy is expected to impact the electricity or energy supply. In this case, it's either increasing distributed generation or causing broader impacts to the power mix supplying the townships, and the scale of impact. So if you go to the next slide, here I'm just showing an image of the solar siting task that also conducted at the same time. Through the SolSmart technical assistance team, in fact, we were conducting a solar PV feasibility assessment for the Westchester area townships. We reviewed 9 municipally owned sites that the townships owned, chosen through consultation with the townships, and we generated, as you see on the slide here, conceptual, PV system design and estimated annual production for each of those selected sites. If you go to the next slide, the reason I'm noting this work is not just because it's a great tie-in to the SolSmart technical assistance, but because we're also able to apply this really useful information derived from the solar siting task to more accurately project the energy impacts of municipally located solar PV. So if we look at the strategy here, installing renewable energy on site to supply municipal operations, you can see the key assumptions we made to project the energy impact. You have the timeline consideration discussed on the last slide that, solar's added over a 5-year period. You have an area of impact, which is increasing distributed generation, and a scale of impact, which is shown through the average solar system size sourced from the technical assistance work. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here, we're just skipping ahead to, the cumulative effects of different modeled strategies. So what you're seeing in this figure is the y-axis is showing the renewable electricity generation in megawatt hours, with the wedges representing different strategies that we modeled with, larger renewable electricity effects. Note that the dotted lines are representing the approximate demand of the townships from that baseline modeling exercise, where the different dotted lines represent the change in the township's demand due to different assumed levels of energy efficiency. So that black line, dotted line, is showing, a lower level of energy efficiency measures taken, while the green line is assuming that, more energy efficiency measures are taken. So, this kind of figure is providing insights into how these different strategies, with their given assumptions, can collectively transform the township's renewable energy supply mix. And, what you can see here is that meeting demand with renewable electricity can be attained by 2047 in the energy efficient scenario, which is the dotted green line, and by 2043 in the additional energy efficiency scenario. That's the dotted green line. The other one's the dotted black line. Note also that the size of the wedge should not be, it's not reflective of how important each strategy may be. This is due to a number of reasons, but for one, the scale may be due to assumptions that could change in the real world. Investing additional time and resources to a strategy, or vice versa, could change the magnitude of each wedge. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to conclude on this kind of benefits and limitations of modeling, because it's a really important note to make when you're thinking about data. On the beneficial side, of course, you're quantitatively portraying the current energy mix, and by mapping out the current energy landscape, you can figure out which sectors you might want to focus more time and energy on. You can also prioritize strategies to be considered in decision-making on this basis. You can find the no-regret strategies and then reduce your focus and time and effort on less promising or less impactful strategies. On the other hand, there are key limitations to modeling that you should always be cognizant of. The model includes changes in forecasts based on anticipated updates to technology and policy adoption, but it cannot account for some human and institutional constraints that would influence policy or program adoption. And of course, we can't predict the future. The model is relying on inputs, and no one can foresee shifts that will occur in the energy system. If you go to the next and final slide here, the key example I'd like to talk about is just COVID-19. The figure on the right has a lot going on, but the key takeaway is to see those, green bars in the lower right-hand corner. This is showing the percent decrease in daily weekday electricity demand in the Midwest US. As you can see, the stay-at-home orders and business closures are significantly impacting electricity demand. This point is just going to show that modeling isn't perfect, but, it can really help to show trends and identify those no-regret strategies for decision makers to focus time and energy on. So with that, I'll turn it back over for questions and answers. Thank you all.
Okay, this is Avery Palmer of the Solar Foundation. So thank you everybody for attending the webinar. I know we're going a little over time, but we want to save a little bit more time to answer any questions you might have. In addition, we will be sending out the slides following the presentation, and if you have additional questions, we'll have contact information for how you can reach us. So if you have any questions, you can simply type the question into the window that should be in the dashboard on your screen, and we will give you just a couple more minutes to type in a question if you have one. So let's start with this question. Have any of the presenters incorporated trees into their planning and included them as carbon reduction through mitigation and cooling attributes, especially if shading of buildings from the west and south could be achieved? Anyone would like to try that one?
This is Steve. I can jump in on that one. The direct answer is no, primarily because we were really focused on sort of energy use and energy generation in our process. But we do think there are opportunities in our climate action planning space when we start getting into accounting for emissions mitigation and reduction to look at that as a strategy.
Great, thanks. And this question is directed toward Jeremiah. For the three RFP bids that would create cash positive savings, would the school boards and city have to vote to move forward with these projects as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We created MOUs for each of the organizations at the outset, primarily just to cover our bases in terms of making sure that everyone was on the same page, that this partnership, although being led by the county and the work up front being funded by my sustainability office, we all had the same end goal in mind, and that is that we would eventually tag this project as collaborators. And so we set up MOUs in advance to sort of hedge our bets against having to go through a formal process to go to each board individually after we got the bids back. So if we had not have done that, yes, I mean, the process would definitely be to go to each individual board and request the permissions to go forward with those projects. But at this point, the way we're approaching it is that, again, because the county indirectly funds all of the utility expenses for these agencies anyway, that we're going to potentially debt finance the entire amount through the county and then get that on the back end in terms of their budget requests for utilities as they request that in their budgets year to year going forward.
Okay, thanks. We'll do a couple more questions. What strategies have local governments taken on to adjust for displaced fossil fuel workers? Would anyone like to take that on?
Hearing none, I can just jump in and say that we did not tackle that issue specifically. Our utility does have coal plant exits, but interestingly enough, the three coal plants that they are part of or own parts of are all located in other communities, actually in 3 other states, none in Idaho, interestingly enough.
Yeah, I can't say that we directly addressed anything like that either. I will say that what we have been trying to support are local programs for creating jobs in the renewable sector. And so through our community college, and that's one of the reasons that they're a partner in this project, is that having on-site renewables, because they do offer some classes in solar PV installation, will be really beneficial for them to have some hands-on opportunities on site. So while we haven't certainly focused on displaced workers in the fossil fuel industry, we are trying to promote workers in the renewable energy sector.
Okay, thank you both. That's definitely a difficult question that we could spend a lot of time on. We'll do a couple more questions. Another question for Jeremiah: how was the contract funded in Asheville and Buncombe County? Was it through the general fund?
It's going to be debt service. It hasn't actually happened yet. Again, we just got the bids on Friday, and so we're still doing our due diligence in terms of going through vendor qualifications and references and things of that nature. But the idea is that we'll debt service it and make those payments out of the general fund, yes.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question. Do you think that funding for renewable and energy efficiency upgrades at the municipal level will be available as budgets get challenged by COVID. And then the question also notes using these projects to decrease overhead spent on energy could help sustain small governments with lower budgets. So I think overall the question is, how do we think COVID is going to affect the budget situation for these renewable energy projects?
I think it's a really fair question. And I think it's one of the reasons that as we sort of look back on the strategy that we chose, we're really grateful that, you know, we didn't do some of these projects as one-off projects, because solar is something that is difficult to pitch to a board that has a lot of priorities, right? Whether it's a city council or a county commission, what have you, if you're pitching them a project that doesn't pay for itself for 15 or 16 or 17 years, I mean, that's a tough sell right now, which is why we decided to sort of go big and you know, only get projects, number one, that we felt like were sort of quote unquote home run projects, but also that if we were to get the aggregated savings that we hoped, which it appears that we have, that we can make the argument, as you mentioned, that, you know, that the cash flow for these projects actually is greater than the debt service payments that you'll make. So, you know, it's definitely a fine line to walk, and one that, you know, I have just happened to also, you know, in Western North Carolina, I work for a board of commissioners that is very split, both ideologically and politically. So I have to be able to sell projects not only on their environmental merits, but on their fiscal merits as well. And if I can't do both, I can't get it done. So, you know, that's one of the reasons that we sort of took the approach we did, to get as much done as we can to make it as cost effective as we could.
Great, thank you for that very helpful response. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. If we did not get to your question, sorry about that. You can see on the screen here the contact information for all the speakers, so I'm sure we'll be happy to follow up if you have additional questions. Can you go to the next slide, please? And before we go, just to repeat, we have 2 upcoming webinars in this series, including on July 15th. The next webinar will be using community choice aggregation to support the expansion of renewable energy, followed by a 3rd webinar on how local governments can buy renewable energy and support market development. And we will follow up with a link to the registration, and we would love to see you on these future webinars. Next slide, please. The SolSmart program is available to follow up and potentially provide no-cost technical assistance to all municipalities, counties, and regional organizations. And we encourage you to contact us to find out more information at info@solsmart.org. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you all very much for attending.